All right. I lost a handle on my window the other day. So, reproduction. So if you had to say, what is reproduction? What would you say? What does it mean if an organism has reproduced? Grace? Made another organism. Another of the same kind of organism, exactly. That's what reproduction is, producing new organisms of obviously the same species. And reproduction is necessary in order for a species to continue. You know, if you had a species and it wasn't able to reproduce, eventually it dies out. What do we call that? Extinction. It can become extinct. So organism species have to be able to reproduce to continue the species. And as we talk about reproduction, there's two main sort of categories of reproduction. There's sexual reproduction, which some organisms use for reproducing. And then there's asexual reproduction, which some organisms use. Some organisms can reproduce in either way. Okay? Some only in sexually or asexual. And so in sexual reproduction, we have two parents. And they somehow mix their genetic material. Genes from one parent combined with genes from another parent, and those genes go into the offspring. Okay? So there's two parents involved. In animals, a sperm cell from the father fertilizes an egg cell from the mother. The genes, the chromosomes, and genetic material combine, and then the offspring has a combination of traits from each parent. But it's not just animals that reproduce sexually. Plants also reproduce sexually. Pollen, that you're familiar with. Pollen is a male reproductive cell from a plant. And it lands on the female reproductive cells of another plant, fertilizes it, and it grows into a seed, which is like a baby plant. So plants reproduce sexually as well. And so because we have this mixing of DNA and genetic information from two parents, the offspring has variation. The offspring are not identical to either parent. They have a combination of traits from each parent. So sexual reproduction increases the variety in the species. But there's another type of reproduction called asexual reproduction. Maybe you're not as familiar with it. In asexual reproduction, basically you just have one parent organism that produces an offspring by itself. But the difference is that that offspring produced by that single parent is identical. It's just like a copy, a clone of the parent. There's no variety introduced. But many simpler, smaller organisms reproduce asexually. Most larger, more complex organisms reproduce sexually, but not all. An example. I forced this plant to reproduce asexually. You know what plant this is? I'm sure you've seen it, many of you.
Basil?
Yeah, it's basil. Okay. So I made this plant, this basil plant, I took, at home I grow basil, I took a leaf off of it, and I put it in some water, and what's it starting to do? Grow roots. Is this its own plant now? Yeah, so you could say the basil plant I have at home is reproduced, and this is a new basil plant. How many parent plants were there? Just one. And I took it off and I put it in here. So genetically, this basil plant is just identical to the one I have at home. It'll taste the same, smell the same genes, same DNA. It's just a copy of that plant. That's asexual reproduction. There was no mixing of genes. There was just one plant, and now I have a copy of it. So like I said, many animals, all mammals, reproduce sexually. This is an amoeba. We'll look at them in, I don't know, several weeks. It's a single-celled organism. And for it to reproduce, it basically just like pinches and splits in two. When you started with one amoeba, you end up with two. But there's only one parent involved. These two amoeba are copies of this one. There's no variety, no variation. We'll also look at this organism. It's a hydra. It's related to like jellyfish. It's got tentacles. One way that it can reproduce is a new hydra just like starts growing out of the side of it, and eventually it breaks off, floats away, and becomes its own organism. Again, it's just from one parent. So it's asexual reproduction. This hydra is identical to this one. Jenna?
Why did organisms start developing this in the first place?
For which one? Sexual reproduction?
Like, animals.
Well, probably the first type of reproduction was asexual, because the first organisms were like bacteria, and they just sort of split in two.
But like, why?
So what is the advantage of sexual reproduction for the species? Can anyone think of it? We'll talk more about this later in the unit. There's an advantage. Is it good to have variation in the species? Why? You're right, it is good. Brandon? What?
Is foreign not to do the same thing every time?
Well, but how about in terms of like survival? Why is it better to have like a wide variety within a species versus all identical? Yeah? Sort of, but not so much, you're close, you're getting there, Brandon.
People have different varieties of like skills, and if you're just the same person, you all kind of know the same.
All right, you're sort of getting to it, but we're not just talking about people here, we're talking about all organisms. If there's a wide variety, there's a more likelihood that some would be able to survive if there's a change. If every hydra is identical because it reproduced asexually, and some disease infects this hydra, is it going to infect this hydra? Yeah, they're all exactly the same. So if it affects one, it will affect all of them. But if they had reproduced sexually, there might be some hydra that have a different variation that allows them not to be infected. And so it increases the likelihood of survival, having some variation. All right. And that leads us to number 7, adaptations and evolution. So one characteristic of life is that all living organisms are adapted to their ecosystem. Over long periods of time, they have adapted and evolved to have certain traits, certain characteristics that allow them to survive, that allow them to be successful. Okay? And through this evolution, species have traits that are helpful. What organism is this? That's a beaver. What is a trait it has that it's developed through evolution that helps it be successful and survive in its ecosystem? Yeah?
The tail.
What about it?
It's like wide and strong. And
Wide and flat and strong. Do you know why that's useful to it?
It can help it swim.
Helps it swim. It also helps it build its lodge by packing mud in. What's another trait a beaver has that helps it be successful? Jordan?
Its teeth,
How are they helpful?
for defending and for building stuff around.
Yeah, they have really sharp and durable teeth that they can cut down trees to build a dam and a lodge. Has waterproof fur, has webbed feet. These are all traits that have developed through evolution that allow beavers to be successful in their habitat. We call those traits adaptations. An adaptation is a trait that helps an organism survive and be successful in its ecosystem. All right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Look at this made-up creature. What's an adaptation that it has that we could see from the picture? David?
Spiky
A spiky tail. What do you think that adaptation, how might that be useful, Sophia? Yeah, probably for defending them. And you can look at this picture, come up with all sorts of characteristics, all sorts of adaptations that allow it to be successful. It has a shell for protection from predators, wings to fly away and evade any predators, sharp teeth for catching prey, and all these different things. We call those adaptations. Okay, so that's the end of our 7 characteristics of life. All living things have all 7 of those characteristics. They use energy, they're made of cells, they grow, they're capable of reproducing, they're adapted to their environment. They maintain homeostasis. Those are our characteristics of living things. All right, so what we're one other thing is viruses. Does anyone know anything about a virus? A virus, Luke?
They can like make you sick.
Yeah, they often can make us sick. For example, the cold, common cold, is caused by a virus. Okay? Meningitis can be caused by a virus. HIV, AIDS, caused by a virus. Okay? HPV is a virus that can cause cervical cancer in women. So these are viruses. But they're not. What is something else that can cause disease? Another type of organism that I'm sure you're familiar with. Chloe? I'm sorry, Chloe?
Bacteria.
Bacteria. Bacteria can cause disease as well. Strep throat, ear infections, pneumonia, things like that. And so viruses are different. Viruses are in this weird category. Scientists don't really know if they should classify them as a living thing or non-living thing, because they don't actually have all those characteristics of life. Viruses are not made of cells. They're just enclosed in like a little bubble of protein. They can't reproduce on their own. Okay, if you have a virus in a petri dish in a lab, it can't reproduce. How do they reproduce? Anyone know? So they can't reproduce on their own. You know, Jordan?
They can reproduce by eating them around and again.
Maybe I could see what you're saying. What they do is when they get into a living organism, they get into a cell and take it over. And they use the cell's own parts to make new copies of the virus, kind of hijack the cell. But on their own, they can't reproduce. So scientists don't really know how to classify them in terms of are they alive or are they not alive. Okay, so we're going to talk in our next section about this concept called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is an idea that people had about where living things come from. So let's start just by this introduction. This is an experiment that was done by Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, and this is his actual writing about an experiment he performed. Here's what he said. If you press a piece of underwear soiled with sweat together with some wheat in an open mouth jar, after about 21 days, the odor changes. And the ferment coming out of the underwear, penetrating through the husks of wheat, turns into mice. But what is more remarkable is that mice of both sexes emerge. And these mice successfully reproduce with naturally born mice from parents. But what's even more remarkable is that the mice which come out of the wheat are not small mice, not even miniature adults or aborted mice, but adult mice emerge. So this is an experiment. You can try it at home if you want. Take some sweaty underwear, put them in an open jar with some wheat, and look at it. 21 days later, you might find mice coming out. And so Van Helmont concluded the smell of the underwear and the odor turns the wheat into mice. What do you think about that conclusion? Good conclusion? He did see this. You would see this if you did it in your bedroom. Hopefully in the corner of your bedroom, you're not performing this experiment somewhere. But what was actually going on there? Claudia?
That the smell like attracted the mice, and maybe when he looked at it, the mice were coming out, so he just assumed that's what happened.
Yes. Probably the mice were climbing in when he wasn't observing the experiment. Sort of makes sense. What was wrong with the way he set up his experiment? There's maybe just one small problem. Eva?
He didn't like do it a bunch of times.
Okay. Well, what if he did? He might find the same result if he did it the same way several times. Is there anything else he could change? Grace? Okay, he didn't observe it like 24 hours a day for 21 days, but something else even. Jenna?
There's no control group.
Yeah? Sophia? Yeah, what if he had covered it? If he had covered it, would he see mice emerging after 21 days? Do sweaty underwear and wheat, does it actually turn into mice? No. Where do mice come from? Other mice. But this may sound kind of crazy to us, but people believed a few hundred years ago that this could happen. They called it spontaneous generation. It's an idea that living things could come from non-living things. That non-living material could turn into living things sometimes, under certain conditions. And it may sound silly to us, but there are some things people observed that made them think this was possible. Such as, people knew if they left a chunk of meat out, raw meat, after several days, all of a sudden, crawling all over that meat would be these little white worm-like creatures, maggots. Even though no maggots, they didn't see any maggots on there, no maggots crawled onto the meat. So they said, of course, the meat turns into maggots. That's what they were observing. They noticed if they left bread out, after several days, things started growing, started turning colors and getting hairy and weird. It was turning into a living organism, mold. They didn't see any mold go to the bread. They didn't put any mold on the bread. It just sort of happened. They thought the bread was turning into this organism. If they left some soup out, some clear chicken broth, after 4 or 5 days, it started to turn cloudy and smell bad. It had this thick layer of kind of like scum on the top that would make you sick if you ate it. It was turning into microbes, these organisms that cause disease. In the springtime, around streams and ponds, once the snow melted, frogs would just come out of the mud where there were no frogs before. They just emerge out of the mud. And people thought in the springtime, mud turns into these frogs. Now, are there other explanations for maggots on the meat? Yeah, we'll talk about those. How about the bread turning moldy? Is it turning into mold? Where's the mold coming from? It's floating around the air, little spores. What about the soup that gets these microbes in it? Does the soup turn into them? Does the soup turn into these little bacteria? Grace? Where does it come from? Yeah, from the air. How about the frogs? Is the mud turning into frogs? What's going on there? Yeah? They hibernate in the mud, and we just don't see them there until they're starting to emerge. So there were other explanations for these things, but people didn't put that all together for a while. So this concept of spontaneous generation today is obviously false, and we know that. But we're going to learn about 3 scientists today that help prove that this is not true. We're going to learn about the experiments they did. The first one was an Italian scientist, Francesco Redi. Francesco Redi was one of the first scientists to do an experiment disproving spontaneous generation in the 1600s. Francesco Redi's problem in terms of experiment, in terms of the scientific method, the question he was asking is, where do these maggots on the meat come from? We never see any maggots. So where the heck are they coming from? He started with a hypothesis, of course. His hypothesis was that the maggots were actually coming from flies that are attracted to rotting meat. So he did a little experiment. Pretty simple. He took 3 jars and he put a chunk of rotting meat in each of them. The first jar he left wide open. The second jar, he put like some gauze covering, like a net over the top. The third jar was sealed completely. So nothing here. All right, so he set up his experiment, he let it sit for a week or so, and then he made his observations. What he observed is in the open jar, flies were attracted to it, obviously because of the smell. They would land on the meat, and eventually maggots did form on the meat. You saw that the flies were laying eggs on this rotten chunk of meat. What do you think he observed in this jar that was covered with the screening? Do you think he saw maggots on the meat in that case? Jordan?
No, but there's no flies in the
Yeah. So in this one, the flies were attracted, but they couldn't actually get to the meat. Instead, they just stayed around the gauze. And actually, they laid their eggs on it. And maggots appeared on the screen, not on the meat. Finally, in the sealed up jar, there were no maggots at all. So what was his conclusion, would you say? Does rotting meat turn into maggots? Well, where do maggots come from? Flies. Maggots are fly larvae. They're baby flies. Just like a caterpillar is like a baby butterfly, a maggot is a baby fly. So flies are attracted to rotting meat, land, lay eggs there, the eggs hatch into these little worm-like maggots.
Is that why maggots like the trash when it's hot outside?
Why what? Maggots what?
Is that why when it's hot outside, like the trash and stuff?
Yeah, so like sometimes, like one time my wife, I don't know, we had chicken or something, and she just threw like chicken and wasn't sealed up in the garbage outside our house, or our big garbage bin. And so when I went to take out the trash, and I was going to throw another bag in there, and I opened up, and there are all maggots crawling all over that. Yeah, it's because that rotting meat attracts flies. They land in there, lay their eggs, and they hatch. Then you have all those crawly maggots.
Oh, so they're like flies and trash.
Yep, yep. So if spontaneous generation were correct, and the meat was turning into maggots, you would have found maggots in here and here, but that's not what happened. So, Redi proved maggots come from flies, not from rotting meat. Yes?
That explains why when you squish a fly, there's like white stuff
Yeah.
coming out of it.
Another scientist we're talking about is another Italian scientist, Lazzaro Spallanzani. He did his research in the 1700s. He was looking at that soup and why it spoiled, why it started to get microbes growing in it. People thought it just turned into the microbes, but he thought those microbes actually were coming from the air, getting into the soup and then growing there, rather than the soup turning into it. So he did a pretty simple experiment. He took some broth and put it in 2 flasks. He heated them both. In one, he let it cool and left it open. Several days later, he saw microbes were growing in there. The other container, the other flask, he again heated it, but then he sealed it, so no air, nothing could get into it. And as long as he kept it sealed, the broth stayed good. Microbes never formed. But then if he took that one, opened it up, the microbes would start to grow a few days later. So again, what do you think his conclusion was about his hypothesis? Jenna?
That microbes do not come from microbes here and don't grow.
Yeah, that the soup, the broth is not turning into microbes. They're coming in from the air and then growing there. Why didn't this one grow microbes? The sealed one. Grace? Yeah, no air could get in and no microbes could get in. Also, because it was heated, it killed any that were in there to begin with. So it had been heated enough to kill the microbes that were already in there, and then it was sealed to prevent any air from One second, I'm going to get to this next slide. I'm going to run out of time. All right, our final scientist was actually a French scientist. The other two are Italian. His name was Louis Pasteur. He did his research in the 1800s. And again, he was looking at these microbes, these germs, these bacteria, and where they came from. He took things a step further than Spallanzani. Spallanzani said they came from the air. Pasteur said, well, they're not just floating around in the air. Actually, his hypothesis is that they are on little pieces of dust in the air. You ever look in like a sun shining in the window? You see all those little dust particles floating in the air? Well, Pasteur said, I think these little microbes are on those dust particles, not just floating on their own. So he did a pretty smart experiment. He made special flasks called swan's neck flasks. They look like this. And they're open at this end. And he put some broth in them. Heated the broth up again. But now air could still get into the broth. However, dust couldn't. The dust settled in this little bend of the flask. And as long as he kept it upright, no microbes formed. Even though air got in here, microbes never grew. His final step is he actually tilted it, mixed some of the broth with some of this dust, and tilted it back. And a few days later, microbes started to grow. What do you think his conclusion was? His hypothesis that the microbes were on the dust. Michael?
That microbes are from us.
Yeah, that his hypothesis was correct. The microbes are actually on the dust. They're not just floating in the air. And so we know today, where do living things come from? Other living things. Spontaneous generation is incorrect. It doesn't happen. Life comes from other living things.
How does spoiled milk form?
Just by bacteria growing in the milk. Now, why does his name probably look familiar? Did you see it this morning when you're eating breakfast, having Fruity Pebbles and milk? Probably did. Who had cereal with milk for breakfast? Did you look carefully at the milk container? You saw his name. Why? Yes, he did. Milk is what? Pasteurized. You've heard of that? Comes from the name of the scientist, Louis Pasteur. What does it mean that your milk is pasteurized? What do they do to it? Grace? They heat it up to kill any bacteria and then seal it so no new bacteria can get in there. That's what pasteurization is. Yep, that's pasteurized also.